I've given this lecture in the past a few times at the North American Saxophone Alliance conference and also the World Saxophone Congress, as well as several times at UNT. In fact, I just gave this lecture about 2 or 3 weeks ago for a class that I teach during the summer session. And typically when I begin my presentation, I like to start with a performance. And if it's live, that's the best because then I can perform live. And the reason that's important to me is because for many years, I couldn't play at all. And I always would start with something like this. Can you see this video okay?
Yes.
So this is a short little example of me playing. And you know that's the third movement of the Kreuk Sonata. And that performance wasn't so bad. But this is how I played just a few years ago. In fact, it's maybe more than a few years ago, about 6 years ago. In the beginning of that video, you could see unwanted facial movement and a scooping formation of my tongue. Here's another example of me simply attempting to produce one of the basic and easiest tones for the saxophone. What you're seeing and hearing is called dystonia. More specifically, this is a clear example of embouchure dystonia. It really looks like muscular chaos, doesn't it? Dystonia is a movement disorder that affects both the nervous system and one's muscles. Embouchure dystonia specifically affects the muscles in the face, the lips, the tongue, and the neck. Everything that creates the embouchure. Yet, there is no pain. Embouchure dystonia can be so severe that it can also affect non-musical activities, like taking a drink from a glass of water. Sometimes there's shaking when I do that. And that's akin to forming an embouchure. It also affects whistling. Here's an example of that. The movement in that video is not gentle. In fact, I would even characterize it as violent. Sometimes it even happens with no physical or musical prompts. Here is a video of me taken one morning just after waking up. So if you might be offended by seeing me without a shirt and unshaven, now might be a good time, to close your eyes. And you can even see the movement goes all the way down my neck and into the chest area. As far as one's performing career is concerned, dystonia is a death sentence. But it doesn't have to be, as long as one seeks help, especially if it is caught early enough, ideally as soon as one notices strangeness in one's playing. And this is the primary point of my presentation. As performers, when we notice something that doesn't seem or feel quite right, seek help. First, from a trusted pedagogue, but if the problem persists, consider seeking advice from medical professionals. I really think I started noticing dystonic symptoms when I was an undergraduate student, but certainly when I was a graduate student in my 20s, although I didn't know what it was. I always assumed I wasn't practicing either hard enough or correctly. Eventually, I figured out a way to compensate, which kind of worked for much of my professional life, but it was always iffy, and there was always a question mark in my mind, will it work today? In 2008, my playing quickly devolved, and by September, I couldn't actually make a sound on the saxophone without biting myself in a very violent way. For the next 4 years, I tried to make it work on my own, but eventually I gave up. I sought advice from my primary care physician, who led me to a neurologist, who led me to another neurologist, Dr. Joseph Yankovich, at the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. And he prescribed Botox injections. Many consider this to be a method of maintaining dystonia, but it is not a cure. Later, I received clinical help from Chong Bai, an acupuncture doctor specializing in both Western and Eastern styles of medicine, which helped tremendously. In fact, I would get acupuncture treatment, and I would show you an example of this. Again, if you would be offended seeing me without a shirt, don't look. But you can see very closely there, I hope, the acupuncture needles in my body. Okay. I also sought advice from a chiropractor and musician's health specialist, Key Fadak, in Fort Worth, as well as a specialist in movement therapy and ergonomics, Joaquin Farias, in Toronto, Canada. Finally, I met Dr. Saj Survey at the UNT Health Science Center in Fort Worth. Along this arduous journey, I received valuable and important information from each professional that helped me. In working with Dr. Survey, he suggested 2 courses of action. First, releasing muscular tension in the culprit muscles, a treatment which he applies during a clinical visit. And second, incorporate the idea of cross-training. So one of the tests he has me do to determine the muscular issues is this. I stick my tongue out and then move it to the right side like this. Then do the same thing and move to the left side. And you can see it's much more difficult for me to move my tongue to the left side. And what the issue is that the base of the tongue is tethered to the stylohyoid muscle right here. So he, in a clinic, he applies 2 myofascial release treatments, and actually they're kind of painful. And I would show them to you right now. So this is me receiving a treatment from Dr. Survey. And first, he's going to work on the muscles of the jaw. That.
The tongue exercise.
Where you stick your finger.
Oh, the actual treatment.
Yeah, the treatment.
Okay. So we're going to treat the jaw first, and then we're going to do the tongue. Okay.
Yep. So he's going to stick his finger right there.
And then close. Press straight back to the pterygoids.
So really he's working on the lateral pterygoid inside my oral cavity, and it's quite tight, and he's basically hoping to achieve a muscular release. And if if anybody has TMJ, this is a very good treatment for TMJ. And then the next part of the exercise is he's going to work on the base of my oral cavity, just under my tongue.
The mouth there, go right on the inside there, and just you can relax your jaw. So set that off. So we want to touch the floor of the mouth here, and then we want to get to the floor of the mouth, or the floor from the bottom too. So we use both fingers together. So the base of the tongue and the floor of the mouth form kind of two layers. So we want to hit the external and internal layers simultaneously, so that we can stretch these out against each other and also hopefully suppress some of the dystonic movement that he's got. Okay, I'm just going to work back a little bit. If you feel like you're going to choke or anything, just raise a hand.
It's actually a very painful treatment.
Good, just a little further. It's pretty tight back here, more than usual. Good.
It might be interesting to see what's going on inside too. And I found this app that's quite interesting that Stanford University puts out. And I'm going to try to share this with you right now. So now I'm using my iPad, I hope. There we go. So you can see this, and this is a great app, Muscle Pro System, and you get to see all the various layers. And what's kind of cool is that you can remove the muscles and put them back and see what's going on. And you can even look underneath, and if you pin it, you can find the names of the muscles that he's working on inside. So there's the lateral pterygoid that he was working on, and the stylohyoid muscle from underneath. And that's kind of slick. So the other way of treating was the idea of cross training. And in this way, Dr. Survey suggested that I practice the flute in conjunction with my daily practice of the saxophone. The skills necessary to create a tone, articulate the sound, and be expressive while performing the flute are similar to the saxophone, yet they are not exactly the same. In effect, by practicing the flute, my performance of the saxophone is indirectly improved. One of Dr. Survey's associates at the UNT Health Science Center, Dr. Yayin Lee, portrayed this process as a way of confusing the brain. Here's an example of me playing an etude with a flute, mostly with success. So, that wasn't so bad, yet here's an example of it not working with the flute. And as you look at this next video, also try to kind of peer inside my mouth and watch what happens with my tongue. So all of those muscles are kind of, spazzing, and that's called the dystonic movement. So more technically, what's happening when one learns an activity, like for instance, playing a scale on a piano, the brain creates a fatty white substance called myelin, and that coats the axons of the nerve endings. And for people with dystonia, that fatty white substance there's too much of it. And that causes the movement to become faster and faster. By cross training, some of that myelin is transferred from some axons to others. The brain only creates a limited amount of that material, and by learning another task, it's moved from some axons of the nerve endings to others. You might be curious to know that people with Guillain-Barré syndrome, there's not enough fatty white substance, and that causes other issues. So before dystonia ruled my life, I performed solo recitals in North America, Eastern and Western Europe, Africa, and Asia. I even performed a solo and chamber recital in Carnegie Hall. All the while, I noticed strangeness in my playing and difficulty doing specific performance techniques. For a variety of reasons, I waited much too long before seeking professional help. As dystonia began to dominate my musical life, I found myself practicing more and more, even up to 6 hours a day, but it got worse and worse. My performance skills quickly devolved over the span of a year, and for the next 4 years, I tried to figure it out on my own, but with very little success. So here's my message to anyone who's willing to hear it. As teachers of young musicians and instrumentalists, constantly be on the lookout for strange conditions that normal pedagogical advice doesn't fix, like excessive, unwanted, and uncontrolled movements in the face or hands. When what would be considered normal practicing doesn't help, consider seeking help from a medical professional and avoid waiting. Typically, I also like to end with some sort of performance, and here's another example. I took this video maybe about a month ago, and this is an example of the biche obad. So there's still a few kind of performance techniques that I find difficult. For a long time, vibrato was totally impossible. Now I can practice it with some success. Articulation, especially in the palm key register, would be very challenging. It would cause my jaw to drop. Intonation was weird. Weird is defined as notes that should be sharp were flat, and I control it. So, of course, I can explain why that would be. My embouchure, the muscles in my face would cause my jaw to, that is the lower mandible, to go down to its furthest position, which would make all kinds of tonal production issues. So that's my presentation.